She used to laugh. She used to dream. She used to see color in the world. And now she is only surviving. Why? What force drained the vitality from her spirit? What unseen hand tampered with her soul? The human psyche is not isolated. It is not an island. It is a living system, fluid, responsive, deeply attuned to its emotional environment. For a woman in a marital bond, the husband is not merely a partner in the external sense. He becomes, over time, a symbolic figure in the architecture of her unconscious. His words, his silences, his glances, his moods, these do not remain on the surface of her awareness. They sink, they echo, they embed themselves deep within the caverns of her psyche. Marriage, then, is not simply a contract between two individuals, it is a merging of inner worlds. And in this union, the woman often becomes the vessel for the emotional tone of the relationship. If the atmosphere is nurturing, respectful, and emotionally intelligent, her psyche reflects this nourishment just as a plant reflects the quality of its soil. But if the marriage becomes a theater of indifference, criticism, emotional coldness, or covert hostility, the same psyche begins to falter. The mind, once vibrant, begins to dull. The spirit, once luminous, begins to dim. This process is not sudden, it is insidious. A smile that becomes a mask, a laugh that sounds hollow, an opinion that goes unspoken. These are not minor details, they are psychic signals. The woman begins to adapt, yes, but not in a way that strengthens her. She adapts by shrinking, by silencing her own instinctive reactions, by questioning her perceptions, her emotions, her value. Her internal world, once autonomous, rich with intuition and energy, starts to orbit around the moods and reactions of the husband. If he is angry, she becomes anxious. If he is distant, she becomes insecure. If he is emotionally unavailable, she becomes over-functioning, trying harder, loving more, giving more, until there is nothing left of her but a pattern of compensations. And here lies the tragedy. Her mental state becomes a mirror of the emotional health of the marriage, especially when her needs are repeatedly dismissed or unmet. She begins to carry not only her own emotional weight, but his as well. She becomes the absorber of tension, the diffuser of conflict, the manager of his emotional immaturity, often without his awareness or accountability. In doing so, her own emotional bandwidth begins to collapse. Not because she is weak, but because her psyche has been quietly invaded by the climate of the relationship. This is the silent architecture of mental illness in many women. Not a flaw in their character, but a psychic response to relational imbalance. The anxiety, depression, confusion, or numbness that emerges is not random. It is the psyche responding to the absence of emotional safety. It is the mind mirroring the instability of the emotional home it lives in. At the core of human suffering lies a subtle, unconscious process, projection. It is one of the most primitive and persistent operations of the psyche. Every human being possesses a shadow, a reservoir of traits, impulses, fears, and wounds that have been denied, repressed, or disowned. These are the parts of ourselves we cannot or will not face, and so instead of confronting them within, we unconsciously hurl them on to others. In marriage, this process becomes especially potent. The spouse, particularly the one who is more emotionally attuned, becomes the screen upon which the other casts their inner demons. When a husband carries unresolved shame, anger, inadequacy, or fear, and he is unwilling or unable to process them consciously, these elements often seek expression through projection. And the one closest to him, the one who sees his soul most intimately, is frequently the target. This projection is not benign. It is not a momentary lapse of awareness. It is a psychic mechanism that can fracture a woman's sense of self. She begins to feel emotions that do not originate in her own psyche. She begins to absorb confusion, aggression, or blame that was never hers to begin with. If he feels powerless, he may accuse her of control. If he feels inadequate, he may criticize her competence. If he feels emotionally dead, he may shame her aliveness. The woman becomes the carrier of his unconscious, the unwilling vessel of everything he cannot accept within himself. The tragedy deepens when this projection is sustained over time, because the female psyche, being relational and deeply empathic, often internalizes the projected material. At first, it may provoke defensiveness or disbelief, but gradually it becomes a self-concept. She begins to question herself, am I really too emotional? Too much? Not enough? This is how projection leads to introjection. The woman takes on the projected shadow as if it were her own truth. And this dynamic is rarely visible from the outside. To others, it may appear like a difficult marriage, a personality clash, or emotional incompatibility. But beneath the surface, a far more subtle violence is occurring, the theft of identity through psychic confusion. The woman is no longer sure where her mind ends and his begins. She lives with thoughts that are not her own, fears that were never hers, and guilt that originated elsewhere. The most disturbing aspect of projection is its resistance to awareness. The projecting partner often truly believes that their perception is accurate, that the flaws lie in the other, that the emotional chaos is being caused by their spouse. They see their wife not as she is, but as a reflection of the shadow they have disowned. This is why projection is so difficult to interrupt. It comes not from malice, but from blindness, a blindness that confuses inner wounds with external reality. In this entangled psychic landscape, the woman becomes both a partner and a mirror, not for love, but for pain, not for celebration, but for accusation. Her every action, no matter how pure or well-intentioned, becomes distorted through the lens of the other's wounded ego. She is not being seen. She is being interpreted through the haze of someone else's shadow. Not all wounds bleed. Not all pain is loud. Some of the most profound suffering arises in silence, gradual, invisible, and corrosive. Emotional neglect, especially within a romantic or marital relationship, is one of the most underestimated yet spiritually devastating forces in the human psyche. It does not scream or shatter glass. It whispers into the soul, unnoticed like a toxin in still water. To be emotionally neglected is not simply to be unloved. It is to be unseen, unfelt, unacknowledged. It is to exist in the presence of another, yet remain as a ghost in their emotional landscape. This kind of emptiness does not reflect the absence of conversation or shared responsibilities. It reflects something far deeper, the absence of presence of attunement, of genuine interest in the interior life of the other. For a woman, especially one whose psyche is wired toward connection, intuition, and emotional resonance, this absence becomes unbearable over time. Her instinct is to bond, to reach, to relate. She speaks not just in words, but in tone, gesture, atmosphere. When these offerings go unreceived, when her emotional being is met with indifference, distraction, or emotional vacancy, her psyche begins to register this void as a threat. And the mind, unable to process this rejection clearly, turns the inquiry inward. Why am I not enough to draw him closer? Why does my presence fail to awaken his interest? What have I done to deserve this distance? In doing so, the woman begins to erode herself. She questions her worth. She silences her truth. She reshapes her behavior to accommodate the indifference of the other, hoping that if she becomes quieter, calmer, more pleasing, she might finally be met. But emotional neglect is not passive. It is not a neutral state. It is a subtle form of abandonment, cloaked in daily routines and polite exchanges. The husband may physically be present, speaking, sleeping, eating alongside her, but energetically he is elsewhere. His gaze does not land. His interest does not penetrate. His presence does not nourish. Over time, this void begins to leach into her identity. The absence of emotional feedback becomes a form of psychic starvation. The feminine psyche is built not just for survival, but for relation, to feel deeply, to connect meaningfully, to be mirrored emotionally. When these needs go unmet, the woman does not merely feel sad, she begins to fracture. Her inner voice becomes quiet. Her dreams become distant. Her emotional range narrows to numbness or longing. This is not weakness, it is the natural consequence of emotional malnourishment. And like any poison, emotional neglect works slowly. It does not destroy the psyche in one blow. It eats away at the structure piece by piece, undermining self-trust, blurring inner clarity, and casting doubt upon one's emotional instincts. The woman may begin to feel anxious without reason, sad without cause, disoriented without explanation. She may find herself losing the desire to speak, to create, to connect. The world becomes gray not because life itself has changed, but because the light within her has begun to dim from lack of response. The tragedy lies not only in the suffering itself, but in its invisibility. Emotional neglect rarely leaves visible marks. It is not scandalous. It does not invite rescue. Often it is dismissed by those around her, even by herself, as something too vague to confront. And yet it is precisely this vagueness, this ambiguity, that makes it so dangerous. It is the wound without a name, the pain without a witness. It is the slow poisoning of the psyche through the absence of love that is not withdrawn but never truly offered. There is a war that no one sees. It does not take place on battlefields, nor does it leave blood on the floor. It happens in the quiet spaces of the mind, in the creases between thoughts, in the sudden weight of an unspoken emotion, in the echo of a voice that does not belong to you, but now lives inside you. This is the war within the psychic struggle that begins when a woman internalizes the dissonance, the criticism, the emotional chaos of another, and begins to mistake it for her own. In the sacred union of marriage, a woman opens the deepest chambers of her soul. She becomes receptive not only to love, but to energy, to meaning, to the subtle signals of emotional truth. And when the man she shares her life with is unkind or critical or inconsistent or worse, when he oscillates between love and detachment, tenderness and cruelty, her psyche begins to split. Not by choice, but by necessity. In order to survive the contradiction, her mind must create compartments, the one that believes in his love and the one that fears it, the self that speaks her truth and the self that silences it to keep the peace. Over time, this inner fragmentation gives rise to a kind of psychological battlefield. She is no longer in conflict with her partner alone. She is now in conflict with herself. Each day becomes a negotiation between voices. Should I speak or stay quiet? Is this feeling real, or am I overreacting? Am I being sensitive, or is this truly hurtful? These are not simple questions. They are weapons forged in the fire of emotional invalidation, and they are used again and again against the very woman who wields them. What makes this war so devastating is its invisibility. To the outside world, she appears functional, composed, perhaps even happy. She may laugh at dinner parties, carry out her responsibilities, smile at photos, but inside there is a war being fought without cease between the self she once was, the self she is expected to be, and the self that is screaming for acknowledgement. This internal war is not just exhausting, it is debilitating. It drains the vital force from her spirit, confuses her intuition, and replaces clarity with self-doubt. The origin of this war is rarely acknowledged. It begins not with a dramatic betrayal, but with small, repeated moments of psychological contradiction, moments where she is gaslit, dismissed, emotionally ignored, or subtly manipulated. Her lived experience is continually denied or reframed until reality itself becomes slippery. She starts to mistrust her own memories, her feelings, her instincts. The very compass that once guided her inner knowing, is now suspect. And without this compass, the psyche becomes lost in a fog of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Even her body becomes a site of the conflict. The tension in her shoulders, the pressure in her chest, the unexplained fatigue, these are not merely physical symptoms. They are the somatic residues of the unseen battle. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. It stores every insult she swallows, every tear she holds back, every moment she betrays herself to preserve the illusion of harmony. The most tragic dimension of this internal war is the isolation it creates. She may not even know how to explain what is happening to her, because there are no visible wounds, no language precise enough to capture the slow collapse of the self. She may even feel guilty for feeling broken, ashamed of her own suffering, believing that others have it worse or that her pain is unjustified. And so she retreats further inward into silence, into self-blame, into a life that looks intact but feels hollow. Within the architecture of the psyche, each individual carries both masculine and feminine energies. These are not merely gendered traits, but deep archetypal forces that dwell within the unconscious. The anima, the feminine image in the psyche of man, and the animus, the masculine presence in the psyche of woman. When these forces are in harmony, they form an inner bridge between consciousness and the unconscious, between logic and intuition, action and receptivity. but when distorted or denied, they become the source of profound internal conflict. For a woman, the animus plays a particularly complex role. He is not simply an inner masculine voice, he is the image of strength, direction, protection, and reason. But if a woman is consistently exposed to a partner, a husband who embodies a negative form of masculinity, the animus she internalizes begins to warp. No longer a guide or protector, he becomes a critic, a tyrant, a cold and judgmental force within her own mind. This distorted animus is not born from her alone. It often begins externally through repeated interactions with a man whose own psyche is fragmented, whose masculinity expresses itself as domination, withdrawal, arrogance, or indifference. Over time, his voice becomes internalized, not merely remembered, but believed. The woman's inner dialogue begins to shift. She hears not her true voice, but his, "You're too emotional, you're irrational, you're not enough, you should know better, you should stay quiet." The animus, once a channel to wisdom and strength, becomes an agent of oppression. What makes this conflict especially dangerous is its invisibility. The woman may not realize that the war she is fighting is no longer with the man beside her, but with the inner image he has implanted within her. She begins to live under a psychic regime governed by someone else's values, someone else's wounds. This alienated animus becomes like an inner judge, constantly measuring, devaluing, interrupting her instinctual flow with commands rooted in fear, not truth. And this psychic takeover creates an inner split. On one side, there is her organic, feminine, self-intuitive, emotional, expressive, longing for connection. On the other, there is the hostile animus, urging her to be logical, detached, silent, submissive. Every decision becomes a battlefield. Should she speak or remain quiet? Trust her gut or defer to reason? Follow her creative impulses or silence them as childish? This internal polarization leads to an unbearable pressure. She begins to feel as though no choice is the right one. Expression feels dangerous. Silence feels suffocating. Her thoughts become laced with criticism, her emotions subject to interrogation. Even her capacity for love becomes suspect under the eye of the wounded animus. She may begin to reject parts of herself that once brought joy, her softness, her sensuality, her voice, believing they are flawed or unsafe. The conflict deepens when this animus is not only critical but seductive. At times he may present himself as the voice of reason, discipline, and control. He may convince her that emotion is weakness, that independence means self-denial, that strength requires disconnection, and so she may mistake his voice for empowerment, not realizing that she is being led further from her wholeness. Yet all the while, the original source of this split remains buried, the lived experience with a man who failed to embody the sacred masculine. Whether he was distant, abusive, manipulative, or simply unaware his energy did not support her becoming, it silenced it, and now that silencing continues not through his actions alone, but through the inner figure she has unknowingly accepted as her own. This animus-anima conflict does not stay isolated in the mind. It ripples outward into every domain: how she parents, how she works, how she dreams, how she loves. She may feel that she is constantly at war with herself, doubting her truth, second-guessing her instincts, afraid to rest yet exhausted by performing. Her inner feminine may begin to wither, not from lack of ability, but from lack of permission to exist in her full range without opposition from the inner masculine force that no longer serves her. The unconscious rules where awareness dares not tread. Until a thing is made conscious, it governs our lives in silence. It speaks in symptoms, in patterns, in emotional eruptions, in the repetition of suffering. And so, in the journey of psychological healing, especially for a woman whose spirit has been wounded within the walls of an emotionally harmful marriage, the first movement toward liberation is not action, it is awareness. Awareness is not the same as knowledge. Knowledge is cognitive, it lives in the mind and may remain disconnected from transformation. But awareness is embodied. It rises like a slow dawn across the psyche. It does not demand immediate change. It simply insists on truth. It is the quiet but radical realization that something is wrong, not with me, but around me and perhaps within me because of what has been around me. For the woman who has internalized neglect, criticism, emotional coldness, or the subtle distortions of psychological projection, awareness arrives not in the form of accusation, but as a remembering. She begins to feel the weight of what she has carried not just physically, but psychically. She notices the voice in her head that doubts her worth. She becomes attuned to the tension in her chest every time she prepares to speak her truth. She observes the fatigue that wraps itself around her every time she bends herself to be more acceptable, more lovable, less difficult. This noticing is the first act of rebellion. When awareness enters, it does not arrive with judgment. It arrives with curiosity. It asks questions that were once forbidden. Why do I feel guilt when I rest? Why do I flinch when someone raises their voice? Why do I disappear when I'm with him? These are not trivial inquiries. They are portals. Through them, the woman begins to reconnect with the lost parts of her soul, those fragments that were abandoned, silenced, or shamed in order to preserve the illusion of love. In the space of awareness, patterns begin to lose their invisibility. The inner critic reveals his tone. The unconscious loyalty to dysfunction becomes evident. The behaviors she once accepted as normal, walking on eggshells, anticipating his moods, silencing her instincts, are recognized for what they are, adaptations, not identity. And in this recognition, she begins to disentangle herself from the false self she constructed to survive. Awareness also brings grief, because to see clearly is to feel deeply. She may grieve not only the relationship, but the years of herself that were lived in shadow, the dreams postponed, the voice suppressed, the self she had to amputate to remain acceptable in a love that asked for her compliance, but not her wholeness. This grief is not weakness. It is a sacred mourning for a self who was not seen, not heard, not protected. But awareness does more than reveal pain. It also reveals strength, the quiet, resilient force that kept her spirit alive even in the absence of recognition. The fact that she can now observe her inner world with compassion, that she can feel what was once numb, name what was once vague, and witness what was once denied, is evidence of a deep, instinctual movement toward healing. The psyche, when given light, begins to reorganize itself toward wholeness. And as awareness deepens, the woman begins to reclaim her psychic boundaries. She stops confusing his voice with her truth. She starts to discern between inherited beliefs and inner knowing. She recognizes that her nervous system is not broken, but responding to years of subtle violation. She understands that the anxiety she carries is not pathology, but a message. The depression, a signal. The rage, a compass pointing toward what has been violated. Awareness is not a solution, it is a turning, a sacred shift. It is the psyche whispering, look again, feel again, name what you could not name before. It is the return of dignity, the slow rising of a woman who no longer consents to being unseen, unheard, or spiritually starved. Not because someone else changed, but because she finally began to see herself through eyes that were not conditioned by pain.